Let's dive right into this explainer, because today we're looking at a story that completely shatters how we usually think about success. It's the story of a man who made an incredible, honestly almost incomprehensible exchange. He traded immense, tangible, worldly wealth, the kind of fortunes most people literally spend a lifetime chasing, for a lasting spiritual legacy. It's the kind of narrative that just forces us to pause, look at our own lives, and really rethink our standard definitions of what it actually means to be rich. Think about this for a second. What if the richest man in your city gave away absolutely everything? We live in a world that constantly tells us to hold on to what we have, right? Maximize profits, build your personal empire, measure your worth by your bank account. But what if the ultimate measure of your wealth wasn't what you kept, but what you were willing to part with? Just imagine having the power to buy anything and choosing instead to give it all away to people who had nothing. Now, this isn't just some hypothetical thought experiment. This is the very real, historical reality of Uthman ibn Affan. He's this incredibly pivotal, highly influential titan in early Islamic history. And he wasn't just wealthy, he was the living embodiment of radical sacrifice. When we talk about early Islamic history, we often focus on the epic battles or the profound spiritual shifts, but Uthman's story highlights a totally different kind of heroism. It's the heroism of profound, staggering economic sacrifice for the survival of the early Muslims. Let's move into Section 1, the wealthy merchant's choice. To really grasp the magnitude of his sacrifice, we first have to understand exactly what he was risking. Uthman was one of Makkah's absolute wealthiest merchants. We're talking about a man of immense worldly riches, deeply entrenched in the upper echelons of society. He had total comfort, status, and absolute financial security. But when he accepted Islam, the early Muslims were not this powerful or wealthy group. They were heavily persecuted, marginalized, and subjected to brutal hardships. He could have so easily used his vast fortune to buy his way out of those struggles, or, just stayed quiet to protect his assets. Instead, he made a deliberate, life-altering choice. He actively chose to prioritize his faith and patiently endure those severe hardships, standing shoulder to shoulder with the most vulnerable members of his community. He valued his convictions way over his fortune. That brings us to Section 2, the Well of Rumah. His incredible generosity wasn't just a fleeting moment of charity or some one-off donation for good PR. It was a lifelong, continuous journey. It started with that initial choice to prioritize faith over his merchant empire, but it only escalated as the early Muslims faced increasingly desperate situations. Whenever a crisis hit, whether it was a community literally on the brink of dying from thirst or the massive requirement to fund an entire military defense, Uthman was there. He formed this continuous habit of stepping up, draining his own resources time and time again to ensure the survival and safety of the people around him. Let's look closely at one of those desperate moments. The early Muslims had migrated to Medina, and they were facing a severe, life-threatening crisis. They simply did not have access to fresh drinking water. The one viable well in the area, the Well of Rumah, was privately owned, and the water was being sold at exorbitant prices that the struggling, impoverished Muslims just couldn't afford. They were in a state of absolute desperation. So what happens? Uthman steps in. He negotiated and bought the well. Now, any other merchant would have seen this as a brilliant monopoly, right? A chance to make a massive return on investment. But Uthman didn't turn it into a business venture. He absorbed the total economic loss and made the water absolutely free for everyone. He saw a community in peril and used his immense wealth to instantly relieve their suffering, completely removing that financial burden from their shoulders. Moving right along to Section 3, funding the Tabuk expedition. Providing basic human needs like water was just the beginning. His extraordinary civic duty extended to literal survival on the battlefield. When the early Muslims faced the daunting Tabuk expedition, they needed to equip an entire army. The sheer logistical cost of this was staggering. Equipping an army in a harsh desert environment is incredibly expensive, and the community was already stretched so incredibly thin. Uthman stepped forward and personally took a massive portion of that burden onto his own shoulders. We are talking about outfitting the defense force with hundreds of fully equipped camels, numerous horses, and dumping massive amounts of gold and silver directly into the laps of the commanders. Imagine the modern-day equivalent of a single citizen buying a fleet of tanks and aircraft for their country's defense entirely out of pocket. That is the level of staggering financial sacrifice he made to ensure the early Muslims were protected. So why do all this? Why effectively bankrupt yourself for others? Why give away a highly profitable well? And why single-handedly fund a massive military operation? In our modern era, we'd probably assume there was an ulterior motive, maybe a bid for political power, a desire for historical fame, some hidden long-term ROI. But Uthman's motivation was radically different from how billionaires today operate. His continuous monumental sacrifice for the early Muslim community was purely faith-driven. His sole motivation was seeking Allah's pleasure. It was an entirely selfless devotion. He recognized that his wealth wasn't truly his to begin with. It was just a tool entrusted to him to serve a higher spiritual purpose. Which leads us to our final section, the measure of true wealth. When we look back at the sum total of his actions, we're forced to confront a really deep philosophical contrast. Think about it. If Uthman had chosen to hoard his wealth, if he had focused entirely on expanding his merchant empire and spending his fortunes on himself, he probably would have been just another rich guy forgotten by time. His palaces would have crumbled and his wealth would have been scattered. But because he completely redirected that wealth toward his faith and his community during their most desperate hours, he secured an immortal legacy. He achieved a permanent kind of success that outlasted any worldly empire. It all boils down to this incredible idea. The best wealth is the wealth that benefits others, for the sake of Allah. This just beautifully summarizes the enduring legacy of his immense generosity. It completely redefines the very concept of what wealth is. It transforms wealth from a static number sitting safely in a ledger into something profoundly dynamic. Wealth is no longer about accumulation. It's measured entirely by its utility. It is measured by how effectively it can be mobilized to alleviate the suffering of others, to uplift a desperate community, and to serve a transcendent purpose. Considering Uthman's extraordinary historical example of generosity, sacrifice, and unbreakable faith, we're left with a powerful mirror to hold up to our own lives. How might this framework challenge your own view of what it means to be truly wealthy? If the richest man in the city found his ultimate success not by hoarding but by willingly giving his wealth away to support his community when they needed it most, how do you measure true riches in your own life? It's a profound thought and a radical challenge for us to take away from this explainer today.